Welcome to the Skapa Podcast, Creating the Future with me, Michael Brasseur.
And me, Rob Murray.
On the Skapa Podcast, we invite amazing leaders across government, academia, and industry to share their vision of the future and how they would like to create it.
And together what we're doing is exploring what it's going to take to turn these visions into a reality. And we're going to discuss the necessary innovations, the strategic shifts, the collaborative efforts to really bring about transformative change across defense and security.
And just to be clear, this is not a podcast for looking backwards or even the here and now. It's all about the future and bringing that big, bold vision of the future to reality.
So today, we're absolutely honored to be joined on the Skapa podcast by Michelle Giuda, CEO of the Krach Institute for Tech Diplomacy at Purdue University. And Michelle is a leader in technology, diplomacy, and strategy with a career spanning public service and private industry. And she's led major initiatives in both government and business, including the largest restructuring of the US State Department in 2 decades. Michelle, we're absolutely thrilled to have you today. Welcome to the show.
I am thrilled to be here. Thanks for having me.
Hey, Michelle, it's great to have you. And for our guest, I'm joining here from the campus of Harvard Business School, where in my dorm room on a developmental program. But so very much an academic connection here. I wonder if you could walk us through your story and how you got to the Krach Institute. I thought it was particularly interesting that you were also a college athlete, and start wherever you like, but that was particularly interesting for me.
Yeah, thanks for that, Michael. Well, if we want to start at the very beginning on how I think I ended up here, a lot of my interest in foreign policy and in politics and how the world works actually stems from my family story and my mother leaving Vietnam in 1975 upon the collapse of Saigon. She came here at 21 to start anew. My father was in the U.S. Navy. I know you were too. He was a Seabee in Vietnam, and so he served there. And so my story from the very beginning and what I heard growing up was fresh out of the Vietnam War and the fact that countries matter, governments matter, the way that we do things matters, and that freedom is really, really precious and really rare. And so I've always had an interest in how do we protect that freedom and advance that freedom. And so got my career started. I always say actually my first career was as a student athlete. And I was team captain of the UCLA gymnastics team. We won a national championship together. And that actually informs a lot of my thinking, really, in how the United States and all of us now need to think about how we're going to win the rest of the 21st century, especially now that we've got new challenges with technology and industry coming together. And there's a role for all of us to be playing and starting to think about where we want to head in the rest of the 21st century. So my first career as a student athlete really is a foundation for how I approach foreign policy and ultimately what we're doing at the Krach Institute for Tech Diplomacy right now. But I started my career in political communications. I used to work for former Speaker of the House, Newt Gingrich. I was with him for a number of years, including as his press secretary during the 2012 presidential campaign. And from there, I went to the private sector. I spent 5 years in New York as head of global corporate communications for one of the largest communications firms in the world. And that was really interesting because it was where I got my first exposure to an experience in working across 81 countries where we had clients all over the world, and how are organizations navigating new challenges like geopolitics in all of these different markets. And then from there was asked to lead communications for the State Department. I was the Assistant Secretary of State for Global Public Affairs. And my work in the private sector in 81 countries prepared me for that, because State Department is really the only agency focused on communicating to foreign audiences. DoD also works globally, but the main audience is in the United States. And so was proud to and very honored to be appointed by the president. And Rob, as you said, I led the largest restructuring at the State Department in 20 years. We modernized all of public diplomacy in order to compete effectively in a digital age where so much of communications is defined by technology now. So the US is far more competitive in the information space. And that's where I got to know Keith Krach, our founder at the Krach Institute, and Meng Chang, who was a science and technology advisor to the Secretary of State and is now the president of Purdue University. And so they asked me to come lead the Krach Institute. after we all left our term of service.
Michael and I know Mung as well. We're working with him at the moment on the Atlantic Council's Commission on Software-Defined Warfare, and so lots of brilliant insights coming out of Purdue with regards to that. But let me pick up on something you've just said there, Michelle, about communicating to foreign audiences. And I am not in a dorm room, although my background may look like it. I'm in a rather unglamorous hotel in Munich because I'm here for the Munich Security Conference that's taking place in the next few days. And this is a major annual event where communication about foreign policy is conducted. And so given that context and given where we are in the world, you said a really interesting thing in your previous answer, and you've spoken publicly about this as well, this idea of winning and perhaps being masters of our own destiny, as opposed to, marching to the drumbeat of others. And I wonder what that means from your perspective when it comes to technology, and what does winning look like when we think about international affairs and the challenges our countries face at the moment?
I love this question. And I think it gets to the heart of what Skapa and this podcast is all about, which is thinking about the future. And I think one of the most exciting things happening right now is this broadening of what we think and who we think owns national security and the destiny of our country and the free world right now. And I think the pivot that we're going through, and technology is driving this because everybody touches technology. It's a part of our daily lives and our national lives. But technology is, I think, bringing to the fore that there is a responsibility by everyone, not just DOD, not just the State Department, not just Commerce, not just NATO, but really every citizen in the free world to play an active role in shaping the trajectory of our security and really our prosperity. And so there's this democratizing, no pun intended, but democratizing, or maybe just a renewal of this sense that citizens, consumers of technology, customers, all have a role to play in shaping what this trajectory looks like. And that's incredibly empowering. But at the same time, it's also a really massive responsibility, or maybe a reminder of our responsibility as citizens in democracies and in a free world. Because ultimately, the power lies with us. It isn't the government. Government derives power from citizens. So if we think about that, it's a really good reminder that we have to be citizen leaders, actively engaged in our own national security. And I think the really great thing is that technology is reminding us of that. And if you look at some of the recent national security and technology intersections in the news, TikTok is right. This isn't a defense technology, but it's in our individual phones, not mine. But 170 million Americans have this on their phones. When we talk about 5G, right, that's something, these consumer technologies now all are intersecting with national security. And so that's a really great thing, because I think it's reminding us of our role that we have to shape where our future is headed. And do we want to win? Do we want to make sure that the free world is dictating the values and the trajectory of these technologies, or do we want to cede that ground to authoritarian states like China, who are very focused on leading and setting the standards for these technologies? So it's both very empowering and a reminder of a big responsibility that we have to make sure that we win.
Let me just ask a quick follow-up there, but I know Michael was going to jump in as well with one. But this is very, very interesting insight you're providing here, Michelle. And it takes me back to when I was head of innovation at NATO and writing the policy for the emerging and disruptive technology work there. And specifically, this notion of standards, technical standards. There are these bodies, these international bodies that determine a lot of our standards. And most people on the planet are not aware of these. They're kind of buried very deep in the spaghetti bowl of these international organizations. And this presents a challenge because those bodies are being dominated by adversarial states, particularly China. I mean, let's just be clear. And they are looking to set the standards. But at the same time, there is frustration from Western states with these international organizations, full stop. And so there's kind of this tension going on here. And that, I feel, presents perhaps a missed opportunity that might be occurring. And I welcome your thoughts on that. And tied to that is citizenship and do we actually think that our citizens realize the power they have and thus the responsibility that comes with that power?
Well, first of all, thank you for all of your great work at NATO and what you built and started, because it's having an impact when it comes to the role of technology and innovation across the alliance. I would say this: there's something really exciting and disruptive that we all could be doing, given some of the maybe the tensions and the frustrations that you mentioned, and that there's a sense that business as usual isn't working or going to work anymore. And one example is at the Krach Institute for Tech Diplomacy at Purdue. One of the things that we did at the end of last year is launch the initiative to develop a global trusted tech standard. And this is based off of our founder, Keith Krach, had developed two standards when he was CEO and chairman of DocuSign, the digital signature management, digital trust management on e-signatures. But we have a precedent for knowing how to set standards outside of government, right? It was industry led. And so what we've done is pull together a governing body. It's chaired by Audrey Tang, who's a cyber ambassador for Taiwan. We have a number of industry and former and current government officials on it. Consider this an invite to have Skapa and Saab be part of helping us to shape this. And the idea is for this to be an enabler and not a name and shame exercise. But how can this be a tool to develop a trusted tech standard that is going to enable frictionless collaboration between trusted developers, providers, and adopters of technology? And we saw how this worked when we were at the State Department. Our founder, Keith Krach, led the Clean Network to Secure 5G, and it was organized around the trust principle, which is that we only want to use trusted vendors. And Ericsson, also out of Sweden, really great partner early on in helping us to define what trust was and what it meant to be a trusted vendor. And then all of a sudden, we had 60 countries. We had 200 telecommunications companies united around the fact that we were only going to use trusted 5G providers. And that did a lot for our national and international security when it came to 5G. So there's an example for how we can do this. Now, the task is to do this across all critical technologies. And that's what we're focused on doing with the Krach Institute. And Purdue really is a major engineering school in defining and leading what it means to be a trusted tech these days. And so there's a disruptive opportunity here. We don't have to rely on these institutions. Can we help them? Yes. But can we find another way to develop something that we know is needed and have that be a tool for these institutions?
Michelle, I wanted to come back to this notion of we're essentially in a race that we're in danger of losing, and a speech that you gave about China uh, as the pre-existing notion that they are the pacing threat in this environment, and you just sort of rejected that assumption. And I wanted to get your thoughts on this notion of pacing threats and where we fit in the mix.
Yeah, so this stems from my student athlete core, and when I was a gymnast at UCLA, we didn't develop our strategy to win a national championship based on what we thought other teams were doing. It was focused on how do we become our absolute best, and maybe gymnastics is a really interesting sport for that because you are competing individually. We're not interacting with another team on the field. But it's, how do you play to win versus play to not lose? How do you make sure you're writing your own playbook versus responding to somebody else? And something I've noticed over the past, let's say 7 to 8 years in Washington, D.C. is I called it an obsession, but an obsession with China as our pacing challenge. You'll see it written in various national security documents as pacing challenge or our pacing threat. I spent a week with the U.S. military across all of the various branches last summer. We got various briefings, and it was all about China as our pacing challenge. And I was like, I would love to hear about what America's vision is and not what we're doing to respond to China, because it's just that's antithetical to the American way. When did we start to look to China to set our own pace? And also, it's not true. We're setting our own pace. If you look at what SpaceX is doing, if you look at what other partners across the free world like Saab and Skapa are doing, right, to innovate defense technology, China isn't setting the pace. We are, but how do we make sure that we're focused on renewing what our vision is for the 21st century, writing our own playbook, uniting around that, and we can respond to what China and other adversaries are doing, but it's not about reacting to their goals. And it's really interesting because designing your own vision is actually a lot harder of an exercise. It's almost like it's easier to edit a paper versus write one. Responding to what China's doing is easy because you just look at what they're doing and then that dictates your next move. Creating and envisioning the future, it's a highly creative exercise. You have to generate a vision, but that's what we have to do now. And we're at this really exciting moment. We're 1/4 of the way into the 21st century. We have a moment right now to say, well, what do we want the next 75 years to look like? The past 75 years since the end of World War II, we've designed a pretty great system. But how do we need to take a fresh look at that and renew really what we want our next vision to be?
Wow, you really touched on something that is near and dear to Rob and I. So, Rob got to NATO and he saw a landscape that needed change, that needed creativity, and he helped design and create NATO's Diana and the NATO Innovation Fund. Similar sort of background for me, and Rob and I knew each other from NATO. um, when I got to the Middle East, we saw a situation, where we had a lot of problems to address when I was at the Fifth Fleet, but limited assets. You had to create your own solution and create the own way ahead. It's what we're doing here at Skapa. Skapa is actually Swedish for to create. So I really feel you really touched something very special to Rob and I as creators. And I just wanted to do a quick follow up because, as far as I know, I don't know of another tech diplomacy institute. This where you bring diplomacy and tech together. Are you the first? And can you share your vision for the Krach Tech Diplomacy Institute?
Yes. So yes, we are the first, and it was really based off of this new frontier we saw in our work at the State Department, where tech and diplomacy were not just intersecting but really colliding. And how do we make sure that we're prepared to succeed in that collision? So yes, we are the first. We're really proud of it. Purdue took a leadership position on this and is using its engineering prowess to make sure that we are helping to unite the free world around the trajectory of emerging technology. So we're very focused on bringing together industry, government, academia, and tech innovators together to make sure that we're aligning around what trusted technology is. It's actually not too dissimilar from the triple helix, and I love that model because it's so creative and Swedish in that it's just a beautiful way to package it. And so we're sort of like a triple helix for tech diplomacy. How do you bring all of these previously siloed sectors of society together in order to make sure that we succeed? And this is where the disruption is happening and where the mind shift needs to happen. And especially in the United States, because there's typically an arm's length between government and industry, and where they do intersect, it's regulatory in nature, not how do we link arms and how do we start to discern and define what the future of our country is. And it's small, but it's a very different, fundamentally different point of view. It's not how do we set guardrails around each other, and other than that, let's just do our own thing. It's how do we unite and make sure that we're working together to dictate the future of our country. So that's what we're focused on doing. And a lot of it starts with education. We launched our Tech Diplomacy Academy just a few months ago, but we're educating the State Department. We're educating the Commerce Department. We're working with NATO's Diana. Rob, such a disruptive and necessary and needed thing. We're working with Diana to educate the members of that network, some of the accelerator and the portfolio companies in there, because we want to make sure that we're empowering our government officials, our business executives, our startup entrepreneurs with the knowledge about these critical technologies and their commercial implications and their national security implications, because that's the triple helix that's coming together. And the more that people are aware of what these implications are, they can shape the policy around it. They can shape the business strategy around it. So we're proud to be educating all of these different organizations. And our goal really is to get to millions and millions of learners, because some of this it just has to be an all of free world movement. If you look at the State Department in the United States as one example, 75,000 employees, 2/3 of those are locally employed staff. So you're looking at about 25,000 civil servants and foreign service officers. To think that the State Department should bear the brunt of having to define the future of tech policy around the world. It's not doable. There's 300 million of us in the United States. How many more across the free world? We all have to work together in order to shape the future. And so we're trying to do that through education first.
And it's no mean feat. I think your point, Michelle, about trying to set a vision is incredibly difficult. And I'm reminded of Machiavelli's quote, there's nothing more difficult to take in hand, more perilous to conduct, or more uncertain in its success than to take the lead in the introduction of a new order of things. And that's what makes a lot of this really difficult, because we're talking geopolitics, we're talking about our values, what it means as nation states, and how these collisions of technology, of statecraft, of academia and so forth, where that takes us. And it isn't easy to be clear about what that looks like and to take people with you. And so I with that in mind, I'd like to understand a little bit more from what you've seen, because you sit at a very unique angle, because if you've got private sector experience, government experience, and now a world-class university institution. What do you think from a policy angle for governments, they could be doing better, leaning into improving, such that the mission of tech diplomacy can be applied perhaps more coherently, or perhaps in an easier fashion? What do governments and policy folks need to be really getting a grip of?
Yeah, I'd say two things to start. One is developing a really strong foundational knowledge and vocabulary of all 22 plus critical sectors of technology that are going to matter to our future. And that's what we're helping to do, right? Because through Purdue University, and you don't need to have a doctorate or a full-on engineering degree. You do need to understand, if you're developing or implementing policy, you have to understand, how do semiconductors work? What are large language models? What are some of the latest innovations in space? Because that's at the core of all policy right now. So I'd say first and foremost, getting familiar with critical technologies. And then secondly is, as we were just talking about, forming a real working relationship with the companies and industry that are commercializing and really driving the adoption of these technologies. And not in the sense of, hey, what can we do to regulate you? But how do we help you innovate at your best? How do we help you as a company succeed? Are there areas where we should get out of the way? Are there areas where we should actually put in some guardrails and some policy in order to make sure that the values of the free world are encapsulated in them? But have a real dialogue, and there's a gap between industry and policy making and policy implementation there. And so bridging that is really important. That's what we're trying to do at the Krach Institute. So I'd say, one, get really familiar with emerging technologies. And then secondly, develop a fundamentally different relationship with industry. And the higher order objective there being, how do we help unleash innovation in order to drive our security and prosperity?
And just on that, it strikes me, as you're describing those priorities for government, that actually what this is doing is starting to build the currency of trust. And you spoke about trust earlier on with regards to our technologies, and we want to have faith and trust in them and such that they reflect our values. And so I suppose through that lens, when we look at governments and policymakers taking that approach, it presumably, and maybe you see this through your work in the Institute, it starts to build trust between the different actors that are in this mix. So in this instance, government policy officials, but also tech startups, investors, end users. And so if that is the case, trust needs to be earned across the board. Maybe just taking that question and flipping it, what do you think on the tech side for the startups of the world, the technologists? What do you think they perhaps need to understand or engage with, noting that triple helix model?
Trust is so important. I'm so glad you brought that up, because it really is the foundation of every relationship. People do business with people they trust. They engage in diplomacy with people they trust. They use technology from companies that they trust. And so it's at the core of a successful relationship. I'd say from a startup perspective, having served in government and now working across policymakers and tech innovators, I think really helpful to understand what the priorities are for policymakers as well. How does policy get made? I think that would be helpful for entrepreneurs to understand. What does it look like to come together and develop a set of principles that are then codified in something like the Prague principles that define trust for 5G? What does that whole process look like? Because diplomacy really feels like a black box, I think, to most people. I learned a lot when I came into government and served at the State Department, and I think it's very different than maybe the military and DoD. There's a lot of citizens that are engaged in serving in the military, like the both of you. Or during the Super Bowl, you'll see the U.S. Army commercial, but you don't see the become a foreign service officer commercial. And so there's not a lot of visibility into what the State Department does. And so I'd say, going to the State Department, sitting down and having a conversation with the folks in the Economic Bureau or the Cyberspace Bureau and just getting a feel for what their priorities are. And at this point, I think just starting a conversation, starting a relationship, having each other on speed dial would go a long way, because we're starting from zero for the most part at this point. And so starting to form that relationship so that there's a productive two-way conversation between tech innovators and policymakers and implementers would go a long way.
Michelle, it's funny to hear you describe, the typical military experience. I haven't been the daughter of a naval leader. My personal experience, having worked at the Department at the U.S. mission to NATO, really brought to life all those things you were talking about. So this intersection of um, defense and technology and diplomacy in really one of the big laboratories for international relations, NATO. Now 32 nations, and we have the defense ministers going on this week. I wonder if you could share for me your vision for tech diplomacy going forward. You're the leader, right? The Krach Institute is the first in the market. Tell us, paint the vision for us and how you see it playing out.
Oh, that's a fun one. I'd say a couple different things. One, just in terms of the education and the know-how that's necessary now to successfully shape the future of our free world and technology. One is having millions of people learning about critical technology and feeling like they're equipped with enough to understand the technology that's impacting their daily lives and their national lives. So I'd say a upskilling in know-how across society. So millions of learners in the US, NATO countries, and the Indo-Pacific would be extraordinary. And that's really our goal. And then secondly is what we're calling a global trusted tech network. So building an alliance where countries are aligned around the concept of trust. And trust is earned when there is respect for human rights, respect for rule of law, respect for transparency and reciprocity, some of the fundamental values that define democratic and free societies, but are absent from authoritarian countries. And so having a network where we know the technology is trusted and that we can do business, we can engage in trade and engage in diplomacy would be great. 180 countries would be spectacular, thousands of companies together. And if you look at the United States and the top 12 countries ranked by GDP, including the EU, they equate to 2/3 of global GDP. So getting our largest techno democracies together to align around trust and some of these values that underpin technology gives us strength in numbers and mitigate some of the economic exposure to maybe retaliation from adversaries like China, Russia, or others. And so there's a lot of power that comes from a network that's unified around certain values. And we would love for our work to fuel that network, and that's what we're focused on doing.
So, as I said earlier, I'm in Munich right now, and I've been at an event today talking about defense technology and investment and the future and so on and so forth. And we had a superb speaker from Ukraine come and talk about how the Ukrainian private sector has absolutely stepped up since 2022, since the invasion by Russian forces into Ukraine. And it is totally different to what we would recognize in our nation states. Now, of course, they're at war, and therefore that has absolutely focused the mind and created a centralized approach, if you like, in terms of, all right, we must win this war. This is an existential threat. But the private sector and the way they've adopted technology and the way in which things have been done with regards to government are just kind of unthinkable in the way in which we go about business at the moment in our countries. And so have you seen, Michelle, any examples from Ukraine, the technology that's being used there, the trust and the relationships that have been built between technologists and government, and how they've gone about essentially creating an incredibly decentralized model of execution, but obviously rallying around an incredibly important cause for their state future? I just wonder if you can talk to that at all.
Yeah, we hosted a delegation of Ukrainian tech CEOs in Washington, D.C. just last week and heard a lot of these same things. And I'd say the really great thing that we're seeing is not just innovation in the types of technologies that are helping them to compete and ultimately win this war, but innovation in the sense of they're re-engineering, showing us a model for how we re-engineer how all different parts of society can work together and be a little bit scrappy, for lack of a better word, but necessarily so, and in a really great way. How do you take technologies and get them into the battlefield quickly? And it's not a matter of going through big bureaucracy anymore. It's a question of survival. So how do you get things to the field fast? We've seen how Starlink showed up very quickly in a time of need. Palantir now helping to. So all these different tech companies, some of the innovation that's happening on the ground by the soldiers, by the private sector and civilians really in Ukraine and across Europe, I think has given a great model how we just re-engineer the way that we work together. And business as usual processes, protocols of the past aren't really necessary and maybe get in the way when the world is at stake. And so it's great in showing us how to be innovative, not just in the technology, but in how we help freedom succeed at the end of the day.
And do you think there's enough strategic humility, I'll use that phrase, in our governments to absorb some of those lessons? Because you're right, there's a scrappy approach by the Ukrainians here where it's very much 75% good enough. And that is a culture that perhaps we're not used to, or perhaps we've forgotten what that's like. And I wonder if there's enough, I'll say strategic humility to embrace that.
That's a great phrase. And I would say, actually, I hope there's actually more strategic inspiration from it, where, it's like, it doesn't have to be this way. How much more can we talk around bureaucracy and the pain of procurement at the DoD before we just decide to do something totally different? Well, we see that there are other ways of doing this, so let's go do it. And I think it's really inspiring. Yes, if we're humble enough to recognize it, and then also hungry enough to recognize some of that. And I think when we see the realities of Russia invading Ukraine and some of these other existential threats across the world from adversaries, hopefully that is enough of a catalyst for us to become hungry again and scrappy again, because that is the fuel of the free world, right? Enterprise, innovation, rolling up our sleeves and getting things done. And it's been good for quite some time, right? At the end of the Cold War, we had the global war on terror. But in general, it's been peacetime across most of the free world. And so having that hunger again and recognizing that we need to kind of wake up and we need to play an active role in the future. And let's try to do things a lot differently, not just a little different. Let's do things differently in order to get results, not just process. I think it's really good inspiration for us.
Michelle, it's so enjoyable to chat with you today. There's a bunch of sort of talk in this space, there's a bunch of people following, but you're truly leading, charting a vision of the future, but you're also doing. And so there's no say-do gap with what you're doing there. What are you most proud of what you've done to date, and what are you most excited about what you will do? And this podcast, we're very selective on the guests. We don't want philosophers, we want doers. And you really come, I mean, you're an inspirational leader and a doer. So again, really, what are you most proud of what you've done, and what are you most excited about what you will do?
Well, first, thank you for saying that. It means a lot, and we take a lot of pride in making sure that we are doing things and shaping the world. And when Keith Krach and when Mung Chang founded the Institute at Purdue, that was the whole vision. It wasn't, can we create another think tank and write a lot of really smart papers? Because there are enough people out there doing that. There's tons of smart papers. But can we get from the what we need to do and why we need to do it and what must be done into okay, how are we going to get this done? Because the how part is actually very hard. And I was listening to your conversation with the Swedish defense minister, and he mentioned project management. And I loved that because it sounds so basic and fundamental, and especially in the private sector. But project management in terms of, all right, how do we educate government officials and business executives and students in tech diplomacy? Well, let's build an online education platform and let's get it done. We got it done in 9 months. And now we've got state and commerce and NATO training on these platforms, a number of tech companies. But the how is hard and it takes basic project management skills. And I love that he said it. So I think operating in this environment in tech diplomacy is what we set out to do. And we're proud to be able to do it. And I think that's the example that we want to set across the board for government partners, for business partners. We want to be a partner to help operationalize all of the brilliant strategies that have been written, all of the brilliant ideas that have been written, and bring them to bear, because we kind of all know what has to be done now. And I'll use procurement as another example. Okay, we know we need to get that fixed in order to be as competitive on the battlefield as possible. Let's start talking about how we get that done and bring the right people together and execute it against a timeline. And so we're proud to be doing that in terms of tech diplomacy, how we secure a number of critical tech sectors, how we bring Purdue's engineering at scale and the workforce that they are creating into these technologies and into national security careers. So we're proud to be doing that. And by the way, with Saab and Skapa is a really critical partner of ours.
Yeah, and we're doing some really exciting work with DARPA on resilient autonomy. We're really happy to be partnering with Purdue on those projects.
And Michelle, what about for you personally? What's coming up? What's coming up next for the next 12 months, 24 months? You've had an amazing career. You've done a huge amount, as we've discussed, but what's happening next in your world?
Well, we're continuing to get as many learners as possible on the Tech Diplomacy Academy. We're working with a number of countries in Eastern Europe and the Indo-Pacific. So we hope to be educating their foreign ministries, their commerce departments, their defense ministries. And so when I say we want to get to 1 million learners, that's what we wake up doing and are focused on every day. So continuing to drive the adoption of the Academy is number one. And then we're going to have the first version of the Global Trusted Tech Standard out mid this year, around June, sometime this summer. And again, would be honored to have Saab and Skapa as a part of that because we need your thinking and your leadership on it. But that's going to come out mid-year this year. And then the goal is, how do we help drive the adoption of that by as many countries and as many companies as possible? So we're all aligning around what it means to be trusted technology so we can collaborate a lot faster and without friction to help advance our future. So that's what we're focused on for the rest of the year.
And so, and that driving adoption, I love the ambition of that. I think that's fantastic. And I've often found that when looking to drive standards, there has to be some sort of either convening power or just market dominance. And in this instance, given the amazing reputation that Purdue has as a university, particularly as an engineering university, I think that's what I know it best for, and aerospace. How has that worked? Putting the institute inside Purdue, using the Purdue brand. How have you found that kind of operating system, if I can put it like that, when then trying to drive those standards and implementation and using that convening power?
Well, it's been extraordinary, and for a couple of reasons. One, Purdue has committed to being a leader in national security and in defense, as evidenced by our partnership together and what we're doing in terms of research, in terms of collaboration, in terms of workforce and development and talent recruitment. So the fact that Purdue has taken a leadership to be a leader in national security has been extraordinary. Not all universities do that, but Purdue has, and President Mung Chiang has been really focused on making sure that we do that. Secondly, Purdue has got a really great model for graduating engineers at scale. And the scale part is really important because if we talk about our ultimate vision to make sure that technology advances freedom, that is no small ambition. And that is essentially requires a lot of scale, working across the world to make sure that happens. And Purdue's got a big vision and has a model for doing that. Purdue graduates more engineers than any other top university in the country. And there's a way to do that and to do it well. And I think they have set a really great model for the 21st century. Semiconductors alone, we're going to need 50,000 more engineers in semiconductors. Purdue's creating that pipeline. And we're helping because we want to create a pipeline of that brilliant STEM and engineering talent also into national security careers, like I said, at the State Department and DOD. And so drawing on that has been great. And then when we go and we talk to allies across the world, or we talk to companies that are commercializing tech, being able to draw from the breadth and depth of the faculty and researchers at Purdue is amazing. Leading in semiconductors, the work that Purdue is doing in hypersonics, in microelectronics, in biotech and life sciences, I mean, there's no shortage of expertise. And so when we talk about really helping government policymakers and policy implementers to understand technology, Purdue's there to help and is dedicated to that mission.
Hey, Michelle, I just wanted to close this out with a quote from my favorite innovator of all time. I know Rob did his quote. Mine is from Leonardo da Vinci. Think well to the end and consider the end first. And that answer right there said to me, you're looking to solve these problems at scale. You've thought well about the future. You've envisioned it as you would like to create it, and you are going after it at scale, which I think is very, very important in this space. It's been an absolutely thrilling conversation for us. I invited you based on that v- speech I saw you give on, hey, nobody sets the pace for us. We're America. We set the pace for the world. And I thought that was just a really inspirational.
No, that's great. Thank you again for your kind words. And it's been an honor to join you. We admire so much the work that Saab is doing, that Skapa is doing to create wonderful technologies and to create our future. And I'll end with my favorite quote, which comes from my father and from the U.S. Navy Seabees, which is can do. And I think that's the mentality that the United States and all of us can bring to figure out how we get the future, the safest, freest, and most prosperous future that we could imagine. So thank you again for having me on. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks very much, Michelle. I should probably point out, I'm not entirely sure if I'm comfortable with Machiavelli being my go-to quote, given the connotations associated with him normally. But anyway, given all of that, Michelle, thank you so much for joining us on the show. It's been a wonderful discussion, really rich insight, lots to reflect on. And for our audience, for our viewers, thank you. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. Thank you for joining. Remember, do subscribe, like from wherever you get your podcasts, and join us next time when we will continue our discussions with leading voices from across the military, government, academia, and industry.